looking at in the stylized diagram. Now, I'm not able to get data for before 1840. I suspect that it exists, and were we to do that, then we would find the birth and the death rate being closer to each other as we go further back in time. Okay, next one. So the next slide has 4 more examples of the transition. We've got 2 more European examples. England and Wales are in the, over here. Going a little bit outside of northwestern Europe, we've got Spain over here. And then it's very difficult to find these sorts of data over long periods of time for populations outside of Europe. But we've got 2 examples here. Taiwan, the transition, I would say, not quite complete, but more or less complete. And over here, we have Egypt. So these 2 transitions sort of represent the developing transitions, and these 2 are obviously 2 more historical examples. Now, importantly, and for several reasons that I'm not going to be able to talk about now, more recent transitions in developing countries have involved much faster rates of population growth than applied in the historical transitions of Europe. So if we look at data for the Netherlands, Spain, and even England, the population growth rate rarely exceeded 1.5% per year, and then only briefly. In the case of France, I think I'm right in saying that the population growth rate never approached 1% per year. I think the peak was about 0.7% per year, looking at things on a annual basis. However, more recent transitions, and you can actually see this if you look at the examples for Taiwan and Egypt, although other populations would show this even more, were the data to exist. More recent transitions have involved annual growth rates of 2.5% per year or more, frequently lasting over many decades. Indeed, in some world regions, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, but not just sub-Saharan Africa, national population growth rates of 3% per year have been common. In this context, United Nations estimates suggest that the populations of West Asia, that's taking the total population of West Asia together, on the one hand, and also sub-Saharan Africa, they both grew at about 2.5% per year between 1950 and the year 2010. So that's a 60-year period at 2.5% per year. And the population doubling time associated with a growth rate of 2.5% is 28 years. So these are rapid rates of growth for extended periods of time. Next one, Gordana. Now, this plot here shows you, if you look at the main line, the top line, the size of the world's population essentially from the year 0 up until the present day. And what I want to emphasize is that when you look at this sort of graph, as you often do, what you're looking at is the outcome of the demographic transition, except here at the global level, at the world level. So people often look at this and they think, oh, the population's gone up. But you've got to understand why the population's increased. That is the growth that is consequent upon what I will refer to as the global demographic transition. So it is the demographic transition that explains the unprecedented growth in the size of the human population since about 1750. And even on that crude graph, you can see that it picks up at about 1750. At the global level, at the world level, taking the human population as a whole, the transition will probably lead to roughly a 9-fold increase in the size of the human population between 1750 and the year 2050, although it will probably come to an end a few decades after 2050. So roughly a growth multiple of 9 for the human population as a whole associated with the demographic transition. Now, I have to say this here. Most of this growth has happened in my lifetime. No, it's a very serious point. most of that growth has happened in my lifetime. So when I was born, and I'm not that old, when I was born, the total population of the world was slightly less than 2.5 billion. It's now 6.7 billion, and of course it's still increasing. I say this partly because I'm amazed at this myself. A short life, hopefully a bit longer, but a huge demographic increase, a huge proportion of that has occurred in my lifetime. And if that population growth is going to have effects, and it does have all sorts of effects, I expect those effects to be lagged, because lags are involved in the whole of the story that I'm talking to you about today, even though I can't go into those lags. But there are lags always involved. Okay. Now, it should be clear to you already that the population growth multiples resulting from the transition vary greatly between different parts of the world, different populations. So for the world as a whole, it's going to be roughly 9. In Europe, looking at the European transitions, which are now over, populations generally increase by factors of, say, 2 or 3. In China, the population growth multiple will probably be in the vicinity of 3 or 4, comparing the size of the population at the start of the transition and the end of China's transition. And in India, the population growth multiple will probably something be like 5 or 6. In transitions elsewhere, however, looking at the rest of the world, growth multiples will vary between 5 and upwards, 5 to 20. If you just take, for example, the United Nations estimates, these suggest that even if we only consider the period between 1950 and 2050, the population of East Africa will grow by a growth multiple of 11, although the population of East Africa was growing before 1950, and it will be growing beyond 2050 for sure. Now, in my view, rapid demographic change is problematic, irrespective of its direction, irrespective of whether it's up or down. So, first slide. A look at, I've picked here Russia and Nigeria, suggests some of the reasons why. And it also highlights the important role of age structure, the age structure of the population, particularly in the context of demographic momentum. And demographic momentum can work in both directions, whether a population is growing or whether it's declining. Now, importantly, the graphs we're going to look at now don't plot percentage age distributions, they plot absolute numbers. Okay, so the next slide. Right, that's what happened to the population of Russia on the left-hand side and Nigeria on the right-hand side during the period between 1950 and 2000. These are UN figures. In broad terms, Russia was in the final stages of the demographic transition between 1950 and 2000. And its population increased from about 103 million to about 147 million. Over the